Good evening, and welcome to the first Wendell Berry Lecture, a series of lectures that will examine the impact of Wendell's seminal work, The Unsettling of America, Culture and Agriculture, on life in the United States. Just a reminder to put your phones on silent, please, and the restrooms are right up here. And afterwards, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and we encourage you, as you're listening, to think of your questions. There's pencils and index cards back there if you need to jot them down, because I would forget my question. So, and afterwards, Ben has said that if you're interested, he'll open the bookstore for any of you all who are interested in coming down to the bookstore. So, Dr. Bayens has written that The Unsettling of America, which came about in response to the conviction on the part of the United States Department of Agriculture and agribusiness corporations that the biggest problem in agriculture was that there were too many farmers and their unabashed willingness to drive the remaining ones out of agriculture, leaving families, communities, the countryside devastated. This is a policy that has not been repudiated to this day, and it is a policy which has influenced decisions and who and what the department has supported since the end of World War II. Indeed, it seems that they've achieved their goal. Less than 0.75% of us make a living farming. In short, The Unsettling of America, Culture and Agriculture is as timely and appropriate today as it was nearly 50 years ago. When Wendell wrote it, he said that he and his book had very few allies. Now, due in part to the establishment of the Berry Center and its programs and its commitment to take up his work, Wendell has an entire world of allies. According to Dr. Bayens, this book is the Berry Center's foundation. It is in that spirit that we've established the Wendell Berry Lecture in anticipation of the 50th anniversary of the publication of The Unsettling in 2027. We could scarcely select a better use of our time than to spend the next 2 years talking about it, thinking deeply about it, and honoring this work and its author, Wendell Berry, and what both have meant and continue to mean to all of us. Tonight's presentation is by Dr. Leah Bayens, Director of the Berry Center Farm and Forest Institute. In 2011, she earned her doctorate in English from the University of Kentucky, where she studied 19th century American literature, eco-criticism, and cultural studies theory. In 2012, she joined the Berry Center's work by founding and directing the Berry Center Farming and Ecological Agrarianism program at St. Catherine College, where she also served as chair of the Department of Earth Studies. She was dean and taught in the Wendell Berry Farming Program of Sterling College from 2018 to 2023, and currently she is the director of the Berry Center Farm and Forest Institute, inaugurated in 2023, a community education-based program which provides approaches to agriculture and forestry that are economically viable, rooted in place, and designed to appeal to community members, early career and experienced farmers. These are courses covering livestock on grass production, low-impact sustainable forestry, agrarian thought and leadership through workshops, short courses, and particularly the legacy and learning of the Berry family. Thus, we see that the course offerings are orchestrated around a country year and merge the humanities and natural sciences with hands-on education. At the curriculum's core is a community lecture series and extended study about agrarian literature, history, and the arts, the Josephine Ardrey Agrarian Voices series, and we are happy and honored to present the Wendell Berry Lecture and the inaugural lecture, The Unsettling of America, What Has Happened Here, with distinguished lecturer Dr. Leah Bayens.
Thank you. Thank you and welcome to the Berry Center. Thank you. I especially want to welcome our friends and neighbors and family members who are here, and also the participants for the Agrarian Voices study, which kicked off today, which is an extended study of the unsettling of America. Before we set off on what will no doubt be a bit of a whirlwind tour of how the Unsettling of America provides key lessons for our work here at the Berry Center, I'll provide a map of sorts of the ground that we will cover. This is an adaptation of the experiential learning cycle that I use in the Farm and Forest Institute courses. There's orienting, defining, applying, and taking it home. Orienting, kind of figuring out where we are, what it is that we're talking about. In this case, we'll start with a kind of a state of the union in the ways that the unsettling of America has proved, unfortunately, a harbinger of things that have come to be. Fortunately, the book's counsel is still as useful today as it was when it was published in 1977, if not more so. As Berry writes in the afterword of the third edition of The Unsettling, quote, "This book has not the happy fate of being proved wrong, but it has had the next happiest fate of belonging to a growing effort to think again about the issues of American land use and to start the changes that are needed." We'll move then to defining, thinking about the unsettling crisis as a crisis by design, and its flip side, thinking about the saving remnants of sticking to places. And lastly, in applying it, we'll delve into how the Berry Center applies these principles in its work, making it possible to farm in full health by supporting land-settling cultures, parity-based economies, and kindly use communities. Then when you take it home, I hope you'll be repeating this particular mantra, which is one that we repeat every single day. What has happened here? What should have happened here? What do we have to work with? So this past weekend, at the Berry Center's open house event, I shared a snippet of the State of the Union, and I admit to being a little bit fretful about some of the sad things that I had to say then and that I have to say tonight. But I also feel hopeful because I know that my colleagues and I are doing the right thing in front of us to do, guided by good, clear thinking and affections for this place and for its people. And so here's what happened. A kind guest from out of state who might be in this room tonight asked me the same questions that my colleagues and I are asked in one way or another nearly every single day. It went something like this. As our last remaining descendant farming the family's land nears retirement, how can we find someone who will farm it in the ways that Wendell describes? I replied, I'll do you one better. With less than 0.75% of people in the U.S. farming, how will you find anyone to farm it at all? My response was no doubt unsatisfying and maybe a little bit on the saucy side, though meant no disrespect. And I went on to summarize the really stark reality, and this is the kind of the thing that was shocking even to me in swimming in these waters every single day. The stark reality that virtually all U.S. farmers, 96% of them in 2019, so virtually all U.S. farmers substantially rely on off-farm income. Absolutely, there are people who don't quite fit that, but this is the majority of farmers that are, regardless of scale, regardless of production method, regardless of crops, location, all farm salaries, wages, pensions, and investments account for an average of 80% of a farming family's household income. And in the case of small farms with off-farm jobs, over 70% reported negative farm income. So if you think about it, across sectors, farmers are using off-farm income to pay for the privilege to farm. What we've created is an unacknowledged but tacitly accepted, privately funded agricultural subsidy, one that fills the gap left by fills the gap left in farm gate prices by a volatile financial economy and by the official publicly funded agricultural subsidy system, which is in the end an agribusiness corporation subsidy. So that means that our tax dollars functionally fund the institutions that made the subsidy necessary in the first place. So no wonder that seasoned farm families find it so hard to stay on the land, that the farmland losses and land speculation go hand in hand. No wonder that The beginning and early career farmers aren't getting started on average until they're mid-40s, so my age. Actually, I'm on the other side of mid now. But they're often doing this after they're securing reliable income in other vocations. Over the last few months, the Berry Center staff, we've been chewing on data highlighted in an article that was published by the Berry family friend, the agricultural journalist Alan Giebert. If you're not familiar with his work, you can find it on the Daily Yonder. He's excellent. He's a great agricultural journalist. He put this dearth of farmers in historical perspective. And yeah, there we go. Thanks, Ben. The United States has the lowest number of farmers since 1850. And that's when we had exponentially smaller population and land bases. He writes, the number of U.S. farms plunged by 142,000, or about 7%, in the 5 years between 2017 and 2022. It's the largest drop in farm numbers over the last 4 ag census periods, and the lowest total number of farms in the U.S. since 1850, when the U.S. was a nation of just 31 states and 4 territories. End quote. He goes on to cite a February 20th, just this year, 2024, report published by a National Sustainable Ag Coalition showing that the federal government distributed $142 billion through farm safety net programs, including about $46 billion for federal crop insurance and $29 billion for commodity programs. So the upshot of all this is that over 5 years, we spent $142 billion public dollars on agriculture and ended up with the fewest number of American farms in over 172 years. The results are that the U.S. increased farm size, with those operating 5,000 acres or more controlling about 42% of all U.S. farmland, and those farms that earn $1 million or more in annual sales generating about 75% of all the U.S. agricultural sales. So, what has happened here? We are shoveling billions of dollars of public and private funds into consolidation of land and money and power without changing the economic system and the culture to pay farmers well and fairly for what they produce. And so here's, with this scene in mind, here's my kind of summary takeaway, my thesis, if you will. If you want to know the summary takeaway from the Unsettling of America for this situation, it's got 5 parts, okay? The only viable way to change the predominant and dominating industrial agriculture system is to change the financial economy. The only way to change this economy is to foster a culture that values the entwined health of land and people. A culture that values the health of the land and the people will make it possible for farmers to afford to farm well. Farmers can afford to farm well when our finances, funding, research, education, energy, and vision are focused on the principles of parity, production control, and cooperation. But to do this, we must think small and be wary of $142 billion solutions while working with what we have lost in our local communities. So while you chew on that, let me back up for a second. Perhaps this talk of data and economics is not how you expected an English major. To begin a talk about spending 25 years of my life studying Wendell Berry's most iconic book. Actually, I brought the first copy of the book that I have, which is held together with a rubber band, and it was my mother's college copy of The Unsettling of America. So this is a generational study. Part of the reason I had to get a new copy is not just because it's falling apart, but because we highlighted everything collectively, like every line in it. Yeah, so, I think that when you think about this, I hope you will believe me when I say that the masterful writing and the ruminations on people, land, and community in The Unsettling of America are much more readily in my wheelhouse than the book's talk of numbers and of policies. This is not my wheelhouse. I mean, come on, the last lines of the first chapter are ones that people can repeat by heart, many of them. The care of the earth is our most ancient and most worthy, and after all, our most pleasing responsibility. To cherish what remains of it and to foster its renewal is our only legitimate hope. I mean, what self-respecting English major doesn't want to ponder the poetry of that prose? One reason that the unsettling is so important, though, is that Berry, also an English major, deals plainly with all manner of subjects in order to get at the radical roots of problems, hitching together beliefs, attitudes, farming practices, health, ecology, community, policies, economics, history, this whole slate of what connects agriculture and culture. After all, each of these is contained in the etymological roots of economics, in the Greek oikos, which means house, or naimen, which means manage. So oikonomia, household management, the stewardship of home, the places in which we dwell. In Berry's estimation, when the ways we manage our home, the land, veered away from the nature-derived foundations of all household management, we got economies of domination, not dominion. Berry wrote this book in part as a response to policies born of an economy of domination, namely the USDA's unabashed mantra that we have a surplus of farmers and that those remaining ought to get big or get out. As the machinations of industrial agriculture ramped up, once settled people scattered hither and yon, mostly to cities, and it's become harder for farmers, rural community members, and urban dwellers alike to stay in place. Berry's words, once the unknown of geography was mapped, the industrial marketplace became the new frontier, and we continued with largely the same motives and with increasing haste and anxiety to displace ourselves, no longer with unity of direction like a migrant flock, but like the refugees from a broken anthill. This unsettling is the norm in the United States and elsewhere, resulting in connected ecological, cultural, and agricultural calamity. Berry calls out the project's policies and funding of a get big or get out approach to industrial agriculture and shows that this program is doing exactly what it was designed to do: eliminate farmers, centralize power, money, and control in the hands of the few. And we see the consequences in a kind of utter destabilization of our rural cultures of interdependence, our land-based economies, and family-scale farming. Doesn't mean there aren't remnants of these, but that continuity has been so utterly disrupted. The consequence is a vulnerable food system that stalls out and shuts down at the drop of a hat, or the drop of a virus, or of a microclip glitch, or a transportation disruption, and absolutely of a volatile market. And all the while, the industrial economy sets us, researchers, farmers, nonprofits, businesses, out on quests for data. The industrial economy's government requires data in exchange for funding, and then entirely ignores or misrepresents the writing on the wall that the data collection reveals. Yet even organizations and individuals who are working at the fringes feel obliged to focus precious time and energy on data because that's what the funding sources require, often with the presumption that collecting data about, for instance, carbon sequestration and practices that improve soil health, that these will contribute to some shift in the larger agricultural economy or policy or in production practices. And unfortunately, these dollars are thrown as bones to family-scale farmers and advocacy organizations who often scramble to fit their work to requirements that often read like solutions looking for problems, and which are overwhelmingly designed ultimately to treat the inevitable symptoms of an unfettered agricultural economy of scale. And worst yet, this scarcity mindset undergirding the unequal distribution of funds often pits us against one another, competing for the same small pools and putting us into polarizing camps. Each camp is taught to dismiss all information from the other camp, even what could be potentially valuable or the points of kind of intersection that might bridge those gaps. And so this separation of neighbors from one another, it's not an accident. It's not an accident that we're put into these camps and that we have tacitly accepted it in whatever ways we have. Keeping us separate does not serve the land and the people, and it is by design. To our way of thinking at the Berry Center, all of this is tantamount to a smokescreen, a strategy fundamentally designed to perpetuate the status quo. Now, I'm going to pause for a second and say, look, I'm not saying don't use the funds. We do. I realize this sounds a little bit like biting the hand that feeds. I'm also not saying collecting, analyzing, and contextualizing data that it's not useful. I'm not saying it's not useful, especially when it's geared towards helping farmers to be economic in like the fullness of the sense of that term. And I'm not saying to quit advocating for funding, public or private, that supports farmers of all stripes. Because at the same time that the capital E economy is undercutting long-term farm health, it's also a piece of what makes any farming possible, combined as it is with off-farm income sources, and in our case, the case of the Berry Center, and with philanthropy. So what I am saying is crucial to look squarely at this big picture, so that while we're grateful for varieties of support that are provided, we're also pointedly applying those resources towards our end goals, fairly compensated, dignified, land-conserving farming. The Unsettling of America teaches us this type of critical thinking and equips us to scrutinize the doublespeak of, for instance, and this is the article, the title of the article that I got a lot of demographic farmer data from. The USDA article is unironically titled, "Family Farm Households Reap Benefits in Working Off the Farm." Thank you for getting that. But, you know, using the unsettling as a guide, we can recognize that most funding, research, or marketing, even that which is ostensibly and incrementally furthering ecological, financial, or social health, that these ultimately are not really specifically designed to increase reliable, fair farm gate income, cooperative cultures and economies, and nature-based land use and stewardship. If they were, my friends and family wouldn't struggle to keep farming. My students would be mortgaging their lives away to get started or facing tenancy as their only viable option. And our visitors and correspondents to the Berry Center wouldn't be wringing their hands over who will come up behind them. Imagine if what rose to the top of our scads and scads of data about farm income were reports showing marked decreases in reliance on off-farm income and an uptick in small and mid-scale farm numbers. That would be a legitimate use of taxpayer dollars. That would be a way to start shifting from a culture and its economy that make it towards a culture and an economy that make it possible for farmers to afford to farm well. Fortunately, this is part of our cultural past, a remnant of the fabric from which we can catch a thread and begin piecing together programs in our own communities that support good farming. If you'll go to the next slide, the title of this talk, as Michelle mentioned, is What Has Happened Here? Well, actually, that's the short version. The long version is this list of questions. What has happened here? By here, I mean wherever you live and work. What should have happened here? What is here now? What is left of the original natural endowment? What has been lost? What's been added? What is the nature or genius of this place? What will nature permit us to do here without permanent damage or loss? What will nature help us to do here? What can we do to mend the damages we've done? What are the limits of the nature of this place, of our intelligence, of our ability? It's a mouthful and a mindful. That's why you can probably see why it was wise to stick with the condensed title, What Has Happened Here? And I pulled this litany of questions not from the Unsettling of America, but from a talk that Wendell Berry gave called Major in Homecoming. It was a commencement address at Northern Kentucky University that he gave in 2009. And in it, he says that a proper education teaches people how to answer these questions, because in so doing, a person will learn to accept locality or home place, and simultaneously to confess our ignorance. You see the next one there. Berry writes, "For we are ignorant to varying degrees of where we are, of what we need to do to stay here, and of what we need to do to assure that our children and grandchildren stay here." So, like a broken record, I keep repeating the mantra, what has happened here? What should have happened here? What do we have to work with? And over the last 25 years or so, I've gone back to the Unsettling of America over and over again. And as I've taken up these questions for myself and in my work teaching college students and neighbors, community members, and children, including my son, yeah, that's the one, my son Burley, and a brood of nieces and nephews. In this image, this is our annual frog spawn inspection in the pond behind our family's farmhouse. And observing, studying, and working with the life of a particular place over a course of a lifetime, combining what you've learned with the stories and lessons from generations who came before, these are essential for inhabitation. Yes, yet this inheritance of homecoming or homemaking, homestaying, sticking, however you want to call it, it's increasingly rare, especially, but not limited to, but especially in rural farming communities. The Unsettling of America shows that the disruption of homecoming, of generational inhabitation, and along with it, its generational knowledge of land and culture, is not new, and it's not an accident or an inevitability. Wendell traces the contemporary unsettlement and economies of extraction to the devastating displacements and violence European colonists dealt out to the people they enslaved and indentured, and to indigenous groups in the Americas. He gets to the roots of how the place we call America was strategically unsettled by, quote, a mentality of exploitation, end quote, accumulation and dissatisfaction culminating in an industrial economy. He argues that ultimately these imperialist forces have been visited on, quote, members of any established people or group or community who essentially become the designated victims of an utterly ruthless, officially sanctioned and subsidized exploitation, end quote. Even so, Berry points out, it's necessary to remember that there has been another tendency. The tendency to stay put and to say, no further, this is the place. So far, this has been the weaker tendency, less glamorous, certainly less successful. It's also the older of these tendencies, having been the dominant one among the American Indians. And in this vein, in the afterword to the Unsettling of America, Berry writes, quote, what we are working for, I think, is an authentic settlement and inhabitation of our country. We would like to see all human work lovingly adapted to the nature of the places where it is done and to the real needs of the people by whom and for whom it is done. At the Berry Center, we pledge our resources to reinvigorating the old cultures of agrarian cooperation, because ancient and recent history alike shows us that this is our best hope for sticking, our best hope for homecoming. So following Berry's leads, we're learning from mistakes and successes and preserving the good parts of the past that will help us make it possible to farm in full health. So at the Berry Center, we work hard to take an inventory of our past and our present to determine what's viable, what will work here. In Kentucky, as in many other farming communities throughout the United States, we have a tradition of cooperative farming that it's in part derived from and inherited from the 1930s Depression-era legislation that helped farmers secure fair prices and reduce the overproduction that damages lands and livelihoods. So in the 8-state Burley Tobacco Belt, the Burley Tobacco Growers Cooperative Association, which is also known as the Producers Program, it provided a fairly stable and equitable economy for rural communities from the mid-1930s up until 2004. The program was led by John Berry Sr. and later John Berry Jr., the father and brother respectively to Wendell Berry. And it orchestrated a system by which farmers earned enough money to cover the cost of production and a fair wage for their work. In other words, parity. The measures made farming viable, and as a result, there were things like hardware stores and restaurants and banks and pharmacies and grocery stores in towns that now have boarded up storefronts. And while tobacco as a commodity product turned out to be an indefensible crop, the Producers Program still stands out as a model of how to sustain farms and communities. So the Berry Center staff and community members have been studying the papers of John Berry Sr. and John Berry Jr. housed in our archive, and Michelle's our archivist if you want to take a peek at those. Helping to better understand the orchestration of the Burley Co-op, as well as the role of a quote-unquote free market economy that, in the role of that in its demise. When the Producers Program ended in 2004, thousands of farms were lost. Kentucky lost about 800,000 acres of farmland, more than any other state in the country. However, Kentucky and the other states that were part of the program, we still have more small and mid-sized farms as compared to other regions of the country that didn't have that supply management program in place. So this is what we have to work with. Fostering these kind of cooperative economics and cultures is one key to the work, and hitching them together with an agrarian economy and perspective is key. But what does that look like? That sounds really nice, an agrarian economy. What does it look like, though? So first I'll start with the big picture, and then I'll bring it down to earth for what it means here. An agrarian economy rises up from the fields, woods, and streams, from the complex of soils, slopes, weathers, connections, influences, and exchanges that we mean when we speak, for example, of the local community or the local watershed. The agrarian mind is therefore not regional or national, let alone global, but local. It must know on intimate terms the local plants and animals, the local soils. It must know local possibilities and impossibilities, opportunities and hazards. It depends and insists on knowing very particular local histories and biographies. So an agrarian economy arises through cooperation between people, land, and community. It arises through connections across landscapes and regions through mutual dependence of rural and urban communities. So cooperative agrarian economies necessarily merge the interdependencies of humans to each other and with nature. And, as I was talking with folks who were participating in our study earlier, I said, this is not a kumbaya picture of cooperation. It's not some sort of easy copacetic scene. Cooperation is really hard. And I also mentioned earlier today that Michelle found in the archive a handwritten note at the top of a church bulletin from 1949. It was written by John Berry Sr. Here's the quote: "We agree to differ, we resolve to love, and we may cooperate to serve." And we take this kind of ethic of cooperation into the work of the Berry Center through the Our Home Place Meat program in particular. It's one example of what it looks like to apply these principles towards a rural cooperative agrarian project. In this burgeoning cooperative enterprise, participating Henry County farmers receive a reliable, fair price for cattle, based on parity and production controls. And likewise, consumers in rural and urban areas receive high-quality product at a fair and stable price. In exchange, farmers manage pastures and cattle according to standards that promote the health of the land and of the livestock. And out on our 200-acre education and production farm and forest, we've been working to meet the needs of the Our Home Place Meat farmers and other farmers in our area with research and training. Because we are philanthropically funded, the center is able to take some of the risks and expenses associated with the needs of these farmers and their families by using it as a kind of experiment station as well as a kind of extension programming site. And so, as you may have figured out from a lot of this, Keeping farmers on the land is one of our first priorities at the Berry Center. Our most recent agrarian lecture series installment was by our friend Brooks Lamb, the author of Love for the Land, Lessons from Farmers Who Persist in Place. And he addresses just this pressing issue. Drawing from Berry's writing, Lamb writes that farmers who persist in place practice imagination, affection, and fidelity on the ground. So while there is much necessary talk about new and beginning farmers, there is much less talk about keeping farmers on the land and the connections between these groups. In fact, those are often groups that are pitted against one another, ironically. And if you want stories, I can tell you. So the question that comes up for me is this. There's a couple of questions, but how will new farmers be able to stay on land if experienced and generational farmers can't? This leads me to the driving question behind our work at the Berry Center. How can we, in making it possible for generational farmers to stay on land because they can afford to farm well, generational and experienced farmers to afford to farm well, how can we simultaneously make it possible for beginning farmers to do likewise? At the Berry Center, we recognize the urgency of stabilizing farming, and we're trying to, quote, come up under what is coming apart with something stable, end quote. That's what our executive director, Mary Berry, that's how she puts it. We know this is a long process that involves the hardest, slowest kind of work, cultural change. Cultural change begins with that mantra. What has happened here? What should have happened here? What do we have to work with? So while you're repeating those words to discover what will work in your own places, go ahead and add to it the Berry Center's mantra: advocate for farmers, land-conserving communities, and healthy regional economies. Thank you all. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Anybody have any questions? If you have them written down, you can hand them to me, or just raise your hand and ask Leah.
I'll do my best. Yes, sir.
Are there many other models in other areas of Kentucky, the United States, as our home place?
Well, one that's a great question. And a couple things. First of all, I love that you use the word models, because we need good models and models that will work in particular places. And that's why the Our Home Place Meet program is starting with our community here, because if we can't make it work here, how on earth is it going to work if we are trying to spread it out to other places, especially those places we don't know so well? So we do think of this as a model that could be adapted in other places. Some of the other models that immediately come to mind for me, the Organic Valley Cooperative, the dairy cooperative, it applies the Burley Tobacco Cooperative principles to its orchestration of production controls and parity pricing. They don't add new farmers to their docket until they know they're going to be able to have the market for that, and that's kind of the model that we have adopted too. We're actually the Berry Center staff in a couple of months is going to be doing some training with Tom Decker, who's actually one of the participants in our Agrarian Voices study, who consults with cooperatives. That's part of the work that he has done for the last 30 years or so, is to consult with groups that are interested in becoming cooperatives. And one of the things that I think has been most important for my understanding of cooperatives has been to recognize that there are lots of different varieties of cooperatives, not only in different sectors, but also that they can take lots of different forms. So there can be very highly kind of administrated and orchestrated cooperatives. There can be some that are cooperative in terms of kind of I'm going to say in name only, but that's not quite right. But that they use cooperation and the kind of pooling of resources at the core of what they do, even if they're not, they don't have what's the word I'm looking for, kind of articles of incorporation in that way. So we're going to be learning more about how we might adapt the program that we've started. And as we're doing that, we'll be looking at lots of models, I imagine. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
You mentioned in the beginning of the lecture the Daily Yonder article.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
That set a pretty, it set a pretty grim picture in terms of the amount of farm animal loss, the numbers of farmers who aren't farming anymore. And I was wondering where in your mind, while considering the work of Berry and the words of past farmers, what exactly is the importance do you see of creating news stories or highlighting news stories, forging, I guess, a new narrative to combat? I'm not sure, maybe combat's not the right word, but to offer a different narrative other than, at times the dismal one that's presented in articles,
Right.
Well-done articles like the Daily Yonder.
Yeah, you're kind of getting me on my Achilles heel here because I usually like to start with with a positive way of looking at things. And when I talked with Mary Berry about this lecture, I said, okay, there's so much ground we could cover here. What do you think I should, what should I home in on? And she said, well, Alan's article. And I said, okay, it seems like these are the things that we hear a lot. She said, here's the data, here are the numbers that they're just fundamentally ignored. And so when I've been studying this stuff since I was, a young college kid. And even for me, seeing that stat that 96% of farmers across all production scales, methods, geographic areas of the U.S., that 96% depend for about 80% of their income on off-farm sources, man, that just changed it for me in a way that helped me to understand the stakes of what we're doing here. And so I think it's a delicate balance in some ways because there are a lot of people I think who are really, listen, what's our rally cry, Shannon, at the Berry Center? It's you don't always win, but you don't always lose either. Yeah, so I don't dwell on that because I'm not geared that way. I just let's just do the thing that's right in front of us to do. It's the right thing to do. Let's see where we find the things that really make sense. Let's see what's going right. And also, if I don't have that piece of information that's back there somewhere, helping me understand the real stakes of what we're doing, it can veer into something that's a little bit more, not vapid, but that doesn't quite have that kind of gravity. And so, I don't know. To answer your question, I think it's really important to recognize that we have lots of saving remnants. We have so many saving remnants of things that are going well. I think about my friend here in the audience, Abby Monroe, who's a farmer. I think about so many things that happen every single day in my life here in this small community that I know from all the stories what the losses are. And what I do is I have the glasses, actually I do have literally glasses, the lenses that helped me to approach it not as what's entirely missing, but what do we have here? Like, what do we have to work with? We got a basketball court at our church parking lot. We got like 20 kids coming up there and playing basketball. I mean, this is like this little tiny place, thank goodness. We have a farm store, for God's sake. We have a farm store in Port Royal, Kentucky. That's amazing. Parker Farm Supply, absolutely amazing. Looking at what it is that we have to work with, that, like, if that doesn't give you some kind of like hope that things can keep going on, they'll keep going on, even if you got all this other stuff that is these challenge, all this other stuff. I mean, you know, like the crippling industrial economy. You know, I mean, yeah, you know. I mean, even within that context, these are the things that I think in our daily lived lives, these are the things that come to the fore for us. So sorry, that was a long answer, but like my coworkers know. I got all the words. Yes, Julian.
This is maybe a related question. There's in the final chapter of the book, on margins, describes this elderly farmer whom he called a marginal person.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
At the end of that, he says, he's held in contempt by the standards of industrial agriculture. He actually presents to us a real possibility. And then he says, all that's required is the property mandate. And that line has stuck with me, because I thought, well, how do you become the sort of person that embraces being a marginal person?
Yeah.
Because everything in our culture says that's foolish. And I'm really curious, you think, you got your PhD, and I don't know, maybe you saw this as your future when you started your PhD, but I'm guessing something changed in you and you took a different course. What would you say has helped you embrace being a marginal person?
That's more.
Or you feel like
it's way more fun on the margins. I mean, I'd say my switch came a lot earlier than my PhD program. I absolutely, part of one of the kind of stories I tell about my experience in higher education is that when I stated I'm committed to Kentucky, I didn't go out of college. I didn't go out of state for college. It's fine for people who did. That's go and do what you need to do, and then maybe come back home. Please come back home if you can. But I committed to being here, and that is not how that academic job market works. And when I stated that claim, I met derision from many people. There were people who came off my committee because that meant that I was naive. I wasn't worth their time. Which to me just confirmed, thank you for taking yourself off my committee. And also confirmed my conviction. Like, this is right. If this is what this means to you, this is the right decision for me. And so I have a story that's really similar to a lot of people who are in my generation. I grew up in Louisville. My mom's side of the family is from Hart County. My grandpa worked at GE full-time for pretty much his entire career. And the thing that he wanted most to do was to get back to Hart County and go farm. And so he drove from Hart County to Louisville for, I don't even know how many years. That's a long commute so that he could farm. And so I spent time with him. I spent time in, Magnolia, Kentucky, and in Munfordville, and in Horse Cave. And I just always liked those places. I knew that was what I liked. I liked that people could know who you were, and that you could, that you could be a part of a community in a place that you could be recognizable. I mean, that can cut both ways. But I always liked that. And I think in terms of margins, I I was pretty rebellious. My mom's here, and you can ask her. As soon as I turned 18 years old, I hightailed it to the country, and I lived in a shack. And I'm not talking about like some cute Thoreau shack. Like, I lived in a shack, and it wasn't romantic, and it was stinky. But you know, it was formative for me, and it stuck. It stunk, and it stuck. But you know, there's so much, I think. There's so much to, like, it's fascinating, like to be in a place and to be utterly fascinated by it continuously for the rest of your life. That's what's, you got one given life, right? You got one given life. What are you going to give it to? To be fascinated by your place, and for those places to be the places that maybe other people don't value very much. Well, I'd rather fight for the underdog, honestly. Sorry, that was also long. You want to end on the underdog? Fight for the underdog. Yeah, Eric.
I'll give a comment, maybe
Yeah.
add on to a question. To start off with maybe some, I'll say, pressing data metrics. And we've talked about changing culture. And with my minimal online presence, I still noticed a month ago that probably the biggest entertainer in America right now, Zach Bryan, posted about Wendell Berry on this.
Oh. Oh yeah, that's right. We did see that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I thought, I can do my little part, but someone like that, how many
Yeah.
people actually Googled that and started that thought process of that?
Yeah.
And I thought about the instances of maybe a second generation of Live Aid, like Willie Nelson would be great. It's a farm crisis, but we can't hardly have a farm crisis, but no more farms. We have a land crisis, but there's not. We've dropped since the 1980s.
Yeah.
And now, but Willie didn't have a philosophical backfitting that I think people could read. But now we have Wendell that could guide these stars that we say, Tyler Childers, the Zach Bryans of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's been really gratifying in our work at the Berry Center to see people kind of come out of the woodwork. I mean, of all stripes, people, this is one of the beautiful things about Wendell and his work, you know, is the kind of the anecdote that I think of is when I have been at the Kentucky Book Fair with him, and I've been the person that's like, oh, you want your book signed? Okay, and then okay, let me open it to this page. I mean, every walk of life, every kind of person coming to have their book signed and to say hello to him and to tell a story. And so we've been really gratified by just the variety of people that have been influenced by his work, and that includes people who are pretty high profile. You know, Nick Offerman reads The Unsettling of America and other books, and he's a major, you know, just a great supporter of the work of the Berry Center, and there are others like that who are using their platforms to direct attention towards these agrarian values in ways that we will never know. We will just never know. But isn't it lovely to think of somebody, lovely and ironic to think of someone coming across a Wendell Berry meme on Facebook. And that's the turning point. Maybe then they read why I will not buy a computer. But yeah, I mean, it's really, it's been a piece of this work that for me has been quite unexpected, and you know, Wendell it's not, as he says, it's not about him. It's about the people. He's just carrying the torch for the people that came before him. He's carrying this mantle, and it's about that legacy. It's not about the individual. But yeah, it's been lovely.
As the director of the Farm and Forest Institute and as the lead in the educational arm of the Berry Center since 2012, you've been thinking a long time prior to that about the role of education in Wendell Berry's ethic of farming. What does it mean that the Berry Center Farm and Forest Institute educates farmers as farmers?
Well, first of all, when you're translating Wendell Berry's writing into a curriculum, and he says to educate farmers as farmers, you figure out, what does that mean? And why is that necessary for him to say that? And I think that what we have seen, especially in formal education, especially in formal higher education, is that most agriculture education programs, I'm going to say most, right? I'm using some nuance here, but most agriculture education programs are not training people to become farmers. They're training them to become agribusiness people, somewhere along that kind of integrated stream, right? And so the other piece of that selection that you mentioned is talking about a liberal arts education, which is also wedded, as it ought to be, with a practical arts education. The fact that you talk about separations, like that's not an accident, absolutely not an accident that the practical and the liberal arts got separated and then got classed. That is not an accident. So this is knowledge even the disciplines, like separate disciplines. I'm not saying like subjects of knowing that there's any problem with saying, oh, well, that's literature and that is math. I know the difference. But I'm not saying there's anything wrong with calling saying that there are these disciplines, but seeing them as being so utterly separated. That's why you've got an English major up here talking about numbers. Like, I better figure out how to talk about numbers because they matter. And the fact that my brain doesn't work very well that way means that, okay, I've just got something I got to work through and I got to work towards. But fortunately, an English education gave me an assurance that that knowledge is connected. All of science, math, philosophy, religion, all of these things, all of these ways of knowing, the practical, knowing how to plow, knowing how to plant, knowing how to pay attention, knowing how to observe the weather, knowing what to do when something all of these things, these ways of knowing and doing, they're all of one piece. But that we've separated them is utterly devastating, and it has limited our ways of knowing so drastically that whether you're a farmer or not, you're affected by this, and it's something that we I hope, collectively we're working through. But to educate farmers as farmers means that we're putting these pieces together, and also that we're training farmers as leaders in their communities. And leaders, like, I'm not just talking about somebody who's going to become the judge executive. That's a part of it. That's like a recognizable leadership position, right? But there are so many different ways to lead. There are ways that you can lead from behind. There are ways that you can make sure that the right people are in the right place at the right time. There are ways that you can do things that are standing up for the right thing that needs to be said and doing it in a way that doesn't just alienate people and force them into those margins, well, not the good margins. And so I think that's why our approach to farmer education has really looked at people as our constituency is agrarians who farm and agrarians who don't farm. The agrarians who don't farm need the agrarians who farm, and vice versa. So if we're treating everybody as if agriculture matters and the land matters, then that's that kind of holistic approach to education that I think is really a part of what we've taken away from that, and how that is that we have viewed the role of education in all of this. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, I can get on a roll with that, but if you start asking me math. So thank you all very much. I appreciate it.